Hi everybody, welcome to English 221. This is for our class for Wednesday, the 1st of February, where I am going to put some closure on Shakespearean biography, talk a little bit about theaters and the Renaissance, and that means that we can transition over finally into reading some of Shakespeare's works. We're beginning with his sonnets, his poems, and then we move to his plays, the first being A Midsummer Night's Dream. So as I had indicated, this would be a good time to get ahead with the readings so that by the time we actually reach A Midsummer Night's Dream, ideally you would have read the play in its entirety, though I know life isn't always ideal. So we will be spending some time talking about performance as well. And that said, understand that a performance is never a substitute for reading the play. It's a supplement. But where we were last class is I was asking you to watch a video about some of Shakespeare's biography. And basically, we know very little about Shakespeare, which might seem surprising considering how famous he is. Certainly, during Shakespeare's time, they didn't keep records in the way that we keep records today. But we do have more information about Shakespeare's peers than we do about Shakespeare, which has led to some conspiracy theories about whether or not Shakespeare indeed wrote these plays, because if he did, would there be more information about his life, which is pretty scanty? And, which I think is a classist argument, would the individual that we know of as Shakespeare been able to write these plays if he didn't attend university? And at least according to the records we have, he did not attend university. I don't think you can teach genius. I think you're born with genius. That said, he only went to grammar school, but as the video discussed, grammar school was pretty complex, and he would be quite well schooled in Latin and Greek and the classics. We have about a handful of Shakespeare signatures, and they're all spelled differently. That, again, would not have been that unusual for the time because spelling had not been standardized, and there weren't even dictionaries in the way that we think of dictionaries. So language had not been standardized. So words could be created and could be spelled based on whim, which might sound attractive until you try to read something that's been written that way, and then you'll see the benefits of standardizing language. We know that we have the documentation of things like baptismal records and birth and death certificates, where we've been able to do some guesswork about birth dates, death dates, and it seems that he was born and also died April 23rd on the same day. Possible, slightly unusual, but possible. A lot has been made of Shakespeare's will and the fact that he left his second best bed to his wife. I oftentimes wondered if the assumption was that this second best bed was the first bed that he and his wife had shared, so there was some sort of a sentimental element associated with it. But of course, we could speculate, and people love to speculate and create mystery. The idea that perhaps Shakespeare didn't write these plays, but that a committee wrote these plays. I don't know about you, but if you've ever served on a committee the way I have, we can't agree on a time to meet, let alone write 30 plus plays and keep it a secret. Could have been someone of the royal court who wrote these plays because playwriting and play acting was seen as kind of lowbrow and unsavory. And there's lots of speculation as to who those individuals might be, even perhaps Queen Elizabeth herself. And not only because of her status, but because of her gender, play acting and playwriting wasn't considered appropriate for women. In fact, men, or I should say boys, played the roles of men. So I suppose if you're looking for a conspiracy theory, you can find a conspiracy theory. Christopher Marlowe is a favorite. I actually did my graduate work in Christopher Marlowe. He was a contemporary of Shakespeare's and wrote the play Dr. Faustus, about a man who sells his soul to the devil for infinite knowledge, and basically he wastes it. So there's a moral or a lesson there. And the thing with Christopher Marlowe is that his life history is quite interesting. He didn't necessarily write as his primary profession. His primary profession was working as a spy for the Queen. And at least the way the story goes, Christopher Marlowe died young in a tavern brawl where basically he was stabbed over an argument about money. And individuals love to create a story that perhaps this death was staged because of some political intrigue associated with his profession as a spy for the Queen, and that he went underground and took on a new identity, aka Shakespeare, and continued what he knew best, which was how to write plays. And of course, someone who has the opportunity to devote themselves full time to writing could exhibit much superior skill. I think it's pretty clear to most scholars and critics that unless there's additional evidence unearthed, Shakespeare is Shakespeare. And I have a brief video for you to watch, and it is under biography, the first section. It's about 4 minutes or so. It's from TED Ed, one of TED Talks. Did Shakespeare write his plays, where they do some analysis of language? And if you're curious as to my position on the controversy, yes, I think Shakespeare wrote these plays. In the end, it probably doesn't matter because what we've got are the plays themselves. But even that can be somewhat problematic. They didn't have copyright at the time in the way that we think of copyright. So they really weren't maintaining records of these plays. That said, it was possible to get written copies of these plays. They would be bootleg copies, if you will. And the printing term that was used for these plays was cuarto, or if you know Spanish, cuatro. You take a large sheet of paper and you fold it twice. So you have a sheet of paper like thus, and you fold it like this once, and then you fold it again, so that you have 4 leaves or 4 sheaths. And it's much like a paperback book. Those were quartos, and there were lots of different versions that you could find of each of the plays. They were usually put together by individuals who were either hired to sit in the audience and write out everything that occurred in the play. You can imagine all the errors there. Or hiring one of the bit actors to reconstruct the play. Again, you can think of all the errors there. Perhaps also some deliberate errors where an actor might want to reimagine his role as a bit more grandiose than what it was. And then what was perhaps remarkable for Shakespeare is that 7 years after his death, his contemporaries got together and tried to put together a definitive version of his work that had never been done before. And that's known as the folio. And that's another printing term where you take a large sheet of paper like thus and you fold it once, so it's much larger. Of course, Shakespeare wasn't there to edit or to proofread, but again, based on his peers, they try to put together the definitive version based on their experiences with Shakespeare's plays. And what editors do is that they put together all of the versions of one play that might exist, and there can be multiple quartos and folio, and then they try to compare and contrast so that they can come up with the definitive version. And some plays are known as problem plays, and they're known as problem plays because they present problems. There isn't necessarily agreement about what it was that Shakespeare wrote. We don't usually study those in school. We study the clean plays, so to speak, the ones where there's very little disagreement. But that said, if you're reading a Shakespearean play, and if you were to have a square bracket within the dialogue, if you think about what a square bracket means in terms of punctuation, this is an outside writer, an editor, adding in a word or words that they think would have been appropriate based on the plot and based on the rhyme scheme. They're guessing. So they're adding in language. Or if you are reading a Shakespearean play and you see the footnotes and there's a question mark after the footnote, that's the editor's best guess as to what that word might have meant during that time period. Again, there weren't standardized dictionaries at the time. It was quite common for authors to create language. Sometimes they created words that were never used again. And Shakespeare created quite a few words, and in fact, we use many of those words in our contemporary day. So many times we're quoting from Shakespeare, we don't even realize it. It's considered cliche, something like dead as a doornail, but it ultimately wasn't cliche when it was first created by someone like Shakespeare. So that means that when you're reading Shakespeare's plays, you have to understand that this is at least editors' best guesses. But these are very, very educated guesses based on the quarto and the folio as to what Shakespeare wrote, unless you're reading a problem play and then it's uncertain. And when you are reading Shakespeare, I always say don't put the pressure on yourself to necessarily understand every single word. Just try to get a holistic sense of the thing. Again, kind of think of it as a kind of foreign language that you have great facility for, and you don't have to translate word for word. You want to try to get a sense of it, remembering that even the scholars themselves have some debate. Even debate about when these plays were published or performed, so that's also guesswork. We usually think, however, that Shakespeare's early career was spent with comedies. And next class, we'll talk a little bit about what a comedy entailed, but you could probably guess that this is a play that ends happily and that uses humor and that's fairly lighthearted. Plays like A Midsummer Night's Dream or Much Ado About Nothing, which is how we are beginning the semester. Probably the most important piece about comedy is that it was about love and all of the conflicts associated with love. And in some ways, you could think of our modern day rom-coms as being illustrative of what we think of in terms of what a Shakespearean play was like and what we think of in contemporary times as a rom-com. So we think that the next part of Shakespeare's career was mostly devoted to the histories, but of course he didn't write just categories of plays at particular times. He would have gone back and forth. And the history plays, as we will talk about when we get to the history plays, we'll be reading Richard II, were based on English history. That part is important, that it's based on the history of Britain. So if it's not about Britain's history, something like, let's say, Antony and Cleopatra, then it's not considered a history play. And there was a history book at the time, Chronicles of Holinshed, that would have been the definitive text for history. So knowing your history can be very helpful when you read these plays. They all stand as independent units, but when you put them together, they tell a much larger story of English history. However, sometimes knowing the history can be a detriment because Shakespeare played fast and loose with the history. In other words, he dramatized it to suit his purposes. So we're still reading fiction. And then we think that the third part, and this would be the height of his career, would be when he wrote his famous tragedies. Hamlet, Macbeth, Othello. Of course, the similarity between Hamlet and Hamnet, the name of Shakespeare's son who died young, is probably not a coincidence. And finally, we think that Shakespeare ended his career with writing something called tragic comedies. In other words, they had elements of comedies, and comedies oftentimes had lots of music and dance and were very celebratory as well. But they also had elements of tragedy within them. They could be quite dark. But in a tragedy, you have death. And in a comedy, there is no death. So when we get to the tragic comedies, and I assigned The Tempest as an extra credit play for us to represent our tragic comedy. I'll talk a little bit about The Tempest when we get to that point in the semester. We wouldn't have enough time to read it and talk about it in its entirety the way we're reading the other plays, but I at least wanted you to know of its existence and give you a bit of a background about it. And we believe that The Tempest was Shakespeare's last major play before his retirement, and it oftentimes is read as a play where he's saying goodbye through his characters, specifically a character named Prospero, where he's saying goodbye to his audience as he is putting an end to his career. For the history plays, as I indicated, we will be reading Richard II, which is, from at least a chronological perspective, the first piece of the story of English history that Shakespeare tackles. He didn't necessarily write them in chronological order, but if you were to begin with the first play, and this would be a king from the medieval period, it would be Richard II. And in terms of the tragedies that we will be reading Macbeth, Shakespeare's shortest play, and also of great interest to me because I'm interested in the Gothic, and it is a very Gothic kind of play. But I think we'll appreciate that it's Shakespeare's shortest play after we've read Richard II, which can be a rather long-winded play. And then finally, Othello, which is a wonderfully contemporary play about gender and race issues. And for those individuals who say that Shakespeare is antiquated, I always talk about something like Othello. We won't have time for Hamlet, unfortunately, which is Shakespeare's longest play, but it probably is Shakespeare's most famous play, so we'll talk about it at least over the course of the semester. And you'll see that in the notes below, I've got in the second section some information about Shakespeare's theaters, because understanding the theater and understanding the theater houses would be just as important as understanding the writing itself. And the theater was the entertainment of the day. It was the television of the day. All levels of society went to the theater. The rich and the poor, the young and the old, the educated and the non-educated. So Shakespeare had to write a play that would apply to all of those demographic groups. And that means that there are multiple layers to the play. It almost reminds me in some ways of Disney movies. It had to be something that would appeal to children, but also have as an appealing element for adults as well. So what you're going to see are multiple layers. Children don't get many of the jokes that adults do in Disney presentations. And you will see that there is a lot of bawdiness and a lot of sexual humor in Shakespeare that you don't necessarily see at first glance, but certainly an older or a more sophisticated audience would have appreciated it in a way that a younger audience would never have understood. So it was for entertainment and also for intellectual stimulation. And the theaters themselves were open air theaters. And because there wasn't electricity at the time, that meant that theater houses were open during the day. And that said, you could have some private, smaller theater houses that could be open in the evening, but Shakespeare's large theater, when we talk about the Globe Theater, could sit thousands, and it would be theater in the round where the audience would sit around and a stage that would jut out. And the beginnings of theater from the English perspective was medieval theater, where you would have traveling wagons that would go from location to location to perform their plays. But obviously that presents some logistical difficulty, if for no other reason being able to collect a fee. So the idea of a permanent theater house that the audience traveled to made much more sense. And because the theater was for all levels of society, all income levels could attend. Also, the very rich would obviously buy the best seats. They would be under covered areas to protect them from inclement weather. And they could even rent a cushion so that they could be more comfortable. And those who were poorest would probably just pay a penny or so for entrance, and they wouldn't even get a seat. They would have to stand in front of the stage. And they were known as the groundlings because they stood there on the ground and they didn't have any covering from the weather. They were also known as the stinkards because they did indeed stink, and hygiene was questionable during Shakespeare's time. We tend to romanticize it, seeing a Shakespearean play, but if you think about it, it's less of what you might think of in terms of a contemporary performance, and more of what you might think of as a, let's say, sports game today, where you've got thousands of individuals who are quite rowdy. The theater was known as a place for pickpockets and prostitutes, where individuals would be drinking ale because the water was unsafe because they were using the waterways for the disposal of their garbage and also for their toileting. And that meant that you would have a good amount of drunken, rowdy people, and there were no bathrooms. So you can imagine the state of the theater. And those groundlings and stinkards, the old joke goes that Queen Elizabeth says that she would take one bath a year whether she needed it or not. And that's really not that much of a joke. There was a certain reality to that as well. So they did stink. But the irony is that Perhaps they had the best seats, so to speak, in the house because they were the closest to the actual stage that was jutting out. It almost reminds me of a contemporary concert where individuals, even though they pay a great amount of money for their seats, they oftentimes stand during the concert itself. Never quite understood that, but nevertheless. All right. You would have a thatched roof. And in fact, that was the first theater that initially burned down. One of the stage effects was a cannon shooting off, which caught the roof on fire. And when they reconstructed that globe, they used a tile roof, which is very smart to make it more fireproof. Plaster walls and wooden joinery. And again, a somewhat seedy kind of place. That said, we're very fortunate that Queen Elizabeth was a fan of the arts and of theater. You certainly weren't going to question the Queen if she was attending. And that probably is the reason why these plays have been preserved for us to read, because of her political support. And the stage itself would have a trap door within it, so that a character could descend into, let's say, the depths of hell if they were to go into the stage, or a character could ascend from underneath the stage to the top of the stage. For instance, if you wanted to have a devil, let's say, ascend into the human realm. They also had overhead stage machinery. You might have heard of the term Deus Ex Machina, which means God in the machine, where basically you're using stage machinery to create special effects, or at least what would have been considered special effects at the time. Ropes and pulleys, for instance, to, let's say, lift a character up into the heavens, or to have a character descend down into stage. Those would be the equivalent of what we think of with special effects, as well as things like using fireworks and cannons. But outside of that, the stage was pretty bare, and you mostly had to rely on the actors and the language. The costumes could be quite elaborate, because clothing at the time of the Renaissance denoted social station, much more so than now. So fabrics, even colors could denote a particular station. So that would be helpful. And in terms of understanding someone's status if you were watching a play. And status was very important. There was something called the chain of being in this society. The idea that there was a grand hierarchy of life forms, and at the very top would be God, the creator. And then the heavens would have a hierarchy of angels. And then the highest, from an earthly perspective, would be humanity, because of our ability to reason. And then would be animals. And within humanity, there would also be stations of hierarchy. You can probably guess, because many of those elements still exist today in regards to our stereotypes. That rich would be higher than poor, male would be higher than female, educated would be higher than non-educated, adult over child, so forth and so on. And at the very top of humanity's hierarchy would be the king or the queen. They would be seen as God's mouthpiece, if you will, and God on earth. So they would need to be respected and honored as if one would respect and honor God himself. Those performances usually occurred again in the afternoon so that they could have light. And theater was considered so seedy that they weren't even allowed to properly advertise. So what they would do is put a flag outside to indicate that a play was occurring, almost in the way that stores do today, where they put a flag outside to say that they're open. The color of the flag would indicate the kind of performance that would be playing. So, for instance, a white flag would be comedy, and a black flag would be tragedy. So, in terms of the notes below, you'll see in the third section, I have some information about text. I had talked a little bit earlier about those quartos, those unauthorized versions of the play. I talked about the folios, that version that Shakespeare's contemporaries created 7 years after his death. Again, interesting side note is that we don't have a portrait done of Shakespeare from life, so there's even controversy about his appearance. I do know that there was one study that was done in the 1990s that was trying to use the portrait of Queen Elizabeth and see if that really was the famous portrait that we think of with Shakespeare if we were to do computer imaging with it. So you can see that if you're looking for a conspiracy, you can certainly find one. Talked a little bit about the genres or the kinds of plays that he wrote: comedies, histories, tragedies, and tragicomedies. And he also wrote sonnets. Sonnets are poems, and we think that he wrote the bulk of his sonnets when the theaters were closed because of plague, which could be for months at a time. People didn't know how the plague was spread. They thought it was airborne. They didn't understand that it was from the fleas of the rats. But nevertheless, the sonnets, Shakespeare's poems, are oftentimes used to try to determine some of Shakespeare's biography. It's problematic because the sonnets will oftentimes contradict themselves. Some of the sonnets seem to have been written by somebody who was younger. Other sonnets seem to be written by somebody who is on the brink of death. Again, it's difficult to date these sonnets. We do tend to divide the sonnets into two groups, one written to a young man, probably the Earl of Southampton, Shakespeare's patron. Having a patron would be so important at the time because a patron provided economic support and perhaps more importantly, political support. And the latter set of sonnets that we think are written to someone known as the Dark Lady, a woman with dark features, not necessarily dark skin, but dark hair and eyes. Keep this in mind when we read A Midsummer Night's Dream and we are introduced to a character named Hermia. And we will start with the sonnets because I think not all of them. Shakespeare wrote over 100, and I just selected 6 or so just to give you a taste of the kinds of writing that he would have done. But it's a good way, I believe, to begin because we can begin to get introduced to Shakespearean language. And what we will see is that they were written in a very strict and stylized form. 14 lines, and they always had a particular rhyme scheme. They always followed a pattern of rhyme, and you determine the rhyme by looking at the last word of each line. And the rhyme scheme, which we identify with letters of the alphabet, A being the first rhyme, and anything that rhymes with that word would be an A. B being the next new rhyme, and anything that rhymes with the B being a B. So the scheme or the pattern would be A, B, A, B, C, D, C, D, E, F, E, F, and then finally G, G, a rhyming couplet, 2 lines that rhyme together. And it had to be about lofty and important themes. It also needed to be iambic pentameter, a 10-syllable line, stressed and unstressed. So you can see that there were lots of parameters that Shakespeare needed to work through, but he was able to do so and still maintain creativity, which is what I think is one of the more interesting things about Shakespeare. We'll see that with his plays as well, that even though he had to follow some formulas for comedies and histories and tragedies and tragicomedies, in some ways these were genre kind of plays, he still was able to show creativity, which is why he's more than just a popular formulaic writer. And the plays even can be divided into a kind of pyramid structure, a 5-act structure, as we will see, that the first act introduces us to characters. And if you're thinking about the pyramid, that would be at the bottom of the left-hand side. And then as we rise up, that would be Act 2, and that would be the beginnings of conflict. And then when we get to the tip of the pyramid, that would be Act 3. That would be the height of conflict or tension. And then as we begin our descent on the right side of the pyramid, Act 4 would be the beginning of descent. Act 5 would be closure. And you can kind of anticipate that pattern in Shakespearean plays. In terms of Shakespeare's plays, I've oftentimes said that I don't think they could pass censors because of some of the risque topics they talked about. And it wasn't that risque to talk about sex or violence. What was risque to talk about was politics. It was a very politically sensitive time, and you certainly didn't want to do something to offend the Queen. That could literally result in death. So Shakespeare did make political commentary, but he did it in a very clever way, so that it wasn't obvious, which is something that we'll talk about as well. So I wanted to talk a little bit more about Shakespeare's politics or the political realm during Shakespeare's time, which is something that we can talk about in further classes. Also, I direct you to the sonnets. The sonnets aren't named, so we refer to the sonnets by either their first line or their number. And this would be sonnets 15, 18, and 20. Those would be the first sonnets that are in the early set of sonnets, and then sonnet 127, 130, and 151. And those would be the latter set of sonnets. So you can find those sonnets at the back of the Riverside Shakespeare, which happens to be my personal favorite version of Shakespeare. But there's lots of different versions that you can find of Shakespeare. I suggest that you find a version that's got some good footnotes, because sometimes having the footnotes can help you with definitions of the plays themselves. You'll notice that in the notes below, I had included some information about where you could find some Shakespearean language. In the section on upcoming readings, I've listed the Folger Shakespeare. Now, the Folger Library is a very famous library in Washington, D.C. It has the world's largest collection of Shakespeare's printed works. And they've come up with electronic versions for free that you can access of Shakespeare's works, such as the sonnets and also the plays. That said, you wouldn't necessarily have access to footnotes. Footnotes are oftentimes copyrighted because they're done by editors. So, but at least you can access the plays themselves. There should be a copy of the Riverside Shakespeare on reserve in the GCC library if you wanted to access it, or even to scan it or photocopy it. And one of the things that we'll talk about as we get to the sonnets is how that language and those themes help to anticipate much of what we are going to be finding in Shakespearean plays. So, I wanted to just briefly talk about our class journals. That's in section 4 of the notes below. And they're meant to be informal responses to Shakespearean texts. Thus far, this has just been introduction. So certainly you can access any of the information that I've given you, but you're not necessarily required to write about it. Your first writing assignment will be on the sonnets, which is what we will be spending a couple of classes on. And your first journal won't be due until February 13th, so you've got a bit of time to write about those sonnets. Due at 11:59 p.m. via PDF, because that's how my grading program works best, to my email, Ruiz, R-U-I-Z, @gcc.mass.edu. What I was thinking is that you would devote about a page or so for each of your journals to what it is that we're discussing. And I don't evaluate them for grammar or mechanics. I just evaluate them for content, as if we were having a conversation on paper. And I evaluate them informally on a checkmark system. So a plus is excellent, for instance, and a check plus is very good, which is where the majority of the grades fall, or a check, which is satisfactory. And there's also less than satisfactory and unsatisfactory. But in terms of the journals, the sonnets might be a little bit different, because there are lots of different ways that you could approach a journal for the sonnets, because we're reading 6 sonnets. It's a little bit different when we talk about the dramas. When you're writing a journal on Midsummer, well, then you're talking about the play in its entirety. So when it comes to the sonnets, you could certainly write on each sonnet if you wanted to. Or what you could do is focus just on one sonnet in depth. Or you can take a middle-of-the-road approach and just choose 2 or 3 sonnets. So there's lots of different ways you could do that. But I'm thinking about a page or so response. And certainly you can incorporate anything that we've talked about in class, whether it be something in a class video or whether it be discussion forum questions and responses. Remember, you don't need to respond to your classmates in the discussion forum, but I do require you to read your classmates' responses and my responses to your classmates, because that's the second piece of this class. The videos are my basically talking about the content that I would have discussed in class, and the discussion forum responses are trying to mimic the class discussion that we would have had. And of course, the writing assignments are still the same. And the last note that I wanted to make is to remind you that what you've got posted on your Moodle is that current week. And as each week goes by, I will put the previous week in a folder at the top of Moodle that says previous class sessions, so that you can always access the week that we're on, but you can always access previous weeks. The last thing I'll leave you with that we can talk about next class about the theaters is that it was very sad, but the theater, the Globe Theater, was torn down by the Puritans who thought that theater was evil and sinful. And that means there's no Globe. There was an actor by the name of Sam Wanamaker who was on holiday in the 1970s in London, who went to visit the Globe Theater and found only a little plaque saying that this is where the Globe Theater once stood. He made it his lifelong mission to reconstruct that Globe Theater. No one thought he could do it. First of all, he had no money. And second of all, he was an American. So how could an American possibly do something like that? That was the British perspective. Gosh darn it, don't you know he did it? And the reconstructed Globe now is in London. And that said, the first performance we are going to be watching of A Midsummer Night's Dream, the one that I will be showing you, was filmed in that reconstructed Globe Theater so that you can get a sense as to what it looked like. They used the most recent scholarship at the time to try to reconstruct it. Now, that said, if you talk to some of the actors who have performed in that theater, they argue that the stage is too large from their perspective. So again, all we've got is the scholarship of the individuals who've devoted a lifetime to Shakespearean theater. And sometimes that scholarship can be wrong, or sometimes it can be revisited. But it'll give you a good idea what a Shakespearean theater looks like. And unfortunately, Sam Wanamaker died before they were able to open the Globe. But it is open now, and they do performances in that Globe. And if you look in the second section under theaters, you'll see that I included something by Sam Wanamaker, specifically the website for his Globe Theater, shakespearesglobe.com. If you go to the link that I provided, Discover About Us, you'll find out all the information about how that Globe was reconstructed and see lots of cool pictures. But again, as I had indicated, we will be seeing a performance actually done in the Globe Theater so that you've got an opportunity to, in effect, experience as much as possible what a Renaissance audience would have experienced when they were watching a performance. So the only thing that's left at this particular point is our attendance question, which would be due on our discussion forum. That would be Friday the 3rd at 8 a.m. Again, if you need additional time, please let me know. So I hope that you've learned quite a bit about Shakespeare over these past few classes. So I'm interested to know, what is the most interesting thing you think you've learned about Shakespeare so far? What is the most interesting thing you think you've learned about Shakespeare so far? And of course, there are no right or wrong answers here. Those are the kinds of questions I like to ask, questions that ask you to consider. So I hope you're doing well. I'm doing well. We will continue on next class, talk a little bit about the political world of Shakespeare and his sonnets. Take care. Bye-bye.